When I first took the night shift job at Red Valley Coal Mine, I thought it was going to be simple. I'd sit in a small control room, watch a few monitors, log the status reports, maybe walk around the tunnels once or twice, and then clock out before sunrise. Easy money, right? That's what I told myself, but on my first night I learned very quickly that there's something deeply wrong about this place. It started the moment I arrived. The parking lot was empty except for 3 trucks caked in dust. I walked across the gravel, boots crunching under my feet while the wind carried the faint smell of sulfur and wet earth. There was no security booth, just a single floodlight buzzing faintly overhead, casting long shadows that stretched into the forest beyond the lot. I paused for a moment, looking at the tree line. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, like someone slipping behind the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. Shaking it off, I headed toward the main office. Inside, I met Harris, a stocky, middle-aged guy with weathered skin, the kind of man who'd probably worked these tunnels for decades. He barely looked up from his thermos when I stepped in. "You the new guy?" he asked, voice low and gravelly. I nodded, told him my name, and he just grunted before sliding a folded piece of paper across the table toward me. "Read that. Learn it. Don't screw it up." I unfolded the paper, expecting to see some safety procedures or emergency contact numbers, but instead, my stomach tightened as I realized what it was. A list of rules. There were 9 in total, typed in an old font with one thing immediately standing out. Rule #7 had been scratched out so violently the paper was almost torn. I scanned through the rest. Always keep your helmet light on after midnight. Never take the elevator down past level 5, no matter what anyone says. If you hear knocking from inside a sealed shaft, do not respond. Do not touch the coal carts if they're already moving. If your radio goes silent for more than 2 minutes, return to the control room immediately. Stay away from shaft 6 after 2:13 a.m. redacted. Never follow anyone into the tunnels unless you see their face first. When the siren sounds, turn off all lights and stay absolutely still until it stops. I frowned and looked up at Harris. "What's rule #7? I asked, tapping the scratched out section with my finger. For the first time since I walked in, Harris actually met my eyes, and his expression hardened in a way that made my throat go dry. "Forget about rule #7, he said sharply. "It doesn't matter anymore. You follow the rest, you'll be fine. Don't, and you'll end up like the others." "The others?" I started to ask, but he stood up, grabbed his flashlight and motioned for me to follow. "Come on, I'll show you the control room." The control room was a cramped, windowless space deep underground, filled with humming monitors and 2-way radios mounted on the wall. A faint vibration passed through the floor beneath my boots, the constant rumble of heavy machinery somewhere deep in the mine. Harris showed me how to monitor the elevator controls, log coal cart movement, and check the air pressure readings. Most of it was straightforward, but I couldn't stop glancing at the old paper pinned to the bulletin board, another copy of the rules, yellowed and stained from years of handling. Rule #7 was scratched out there too, but someone had written something faint beneath the scratch marks in pencil, just barely visible under the fluorescent light. "If they call your name, but it isn't them." I froze for a second, trying to make sense of it, but Harris slammed a binder shut and startled me. "Focus, kid. Eyes on the screens, not the ghosts." He must have seen the question on my face because he sighed and leaned against the desk. "Look, this mine's old. Older than me, older than my daddy. There are stories. Weird ones. People hear things down here they shouldn't. Shadows where there ain't no shadows. But you, keep your head down, follow the rules, and you go home safe. That's all you need to know." I nodded, pretending his words reassured me, but my gut told me there was a lot he wasn't saying. By midnight, Harris left for his patrol around shaft 4, leaving me alone in the control room. The silence was almost total, except for the low hum of the ventilation fans. I leaned back in the chair, sipping cold coffee, and scanned the monitors. Most cameras showed empty tunnels lined with steel beams and rails. The deeper levels looked damp, with walls slick from groundwater. Every now and then the lights would flicker, making the shadows crawl unnaturally across the walls. At one point around 12:37 a.m., I noticed movement on camera 6, just a brief flash like someone darting past the edge of the frame. I sat up, squinting at the grainy feed, but the figure didn't return. I checked the map. Camera 6 was monitoring Shaft 6, the one explicitly mentioned in Rule #6. I remembered the exact wording. Stay away from Shaft 6 after 2:13 a.m. But it was only 12:37, so what the hell did I just see down there? I switched on the radio and called Harris. "Hey, you near Shaft 6? Thought I saw something." Static hissed back at me for several seconds before Harris's voice finally came through, rough and faint. "No, I'm at Shaft 4. Stay in the control room, Ethan. Whatever you saw, it wasn't anyone who should be there." My chest tightened. "What does that mean?" I asked, but Harris didn't reply. I kept staring at the monitors until my eyes burned. At 1:05 a.m., a faint knocking sound broke the silence, slow and deliberate. Knock, 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 echoing faintly through the ventilation shafts. I froze. The sound seemed distant at first, maybe from one of the sealed tunnels, and then I remembered Rule #3. If you hear knocking from inside a sealed shaft, do not respond. I forced myself to stay still, not even breathing too loud, waiting for the sound to stop. But after the 5th knock, a voice followed, muffled and strained like it was coming through water. "Ethan." My blood ran cold. It was my name. Whoever, or whatever thought it was, it whispered it softly, dragging out each syllable like it was testing how my name felt in its mouth. My brain screamed at me not to answer, but my throat went dry. I reached for the radio instead. "Harris. There's someone knocking. They're saying my name." No response, just static. I stood up, moving to the door of the control room and strained to listen. The knocking stopped completely, replaced by silence so deep I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then came another sound, closer this time, scraping against the concrete floor right outside the door. Slow, dragging footsteps. I tightened my grip on the handle of the flashlight Harris gave me, ready to swing it if I had to. Then a voice came, clearer now, from the other side of the door. "Ethan, it's me. Harris, open up. We need to leave." Relief washed over me for half a second, but then I froze. Harris was supposed to be at Shaft 4. There was no way he could have made it back this quickly, not without the elevators, and I hadn't heard any approaching footsteps until now. Something wasn't right. I crept closer to the door, keeping silent. "Harris," I called, voice trembling. There was a pause, and then the voice outside replied, perfectly calm, perfectly steady. "Yes, it's me. Open up." I backed away, heart hammering, staring at the radios, the scratched out Rule #7 and that faint haunting pencil mark. If they call your name, but it isn't them. I stood frozen in the control room, staring at the heavy steel door, my knuckles white around the handle of my flashlight, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. That voice outside, soft and steady, claimed to be Harris, but something about it was wrong. Harris had left less than 10 minutes ago to patrol near Shaft 4, and I knew there was no way he could have walked all the way back here without me hearing the elevator or his boots crunching on the gravel-lined tunnel floor. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible, my eyes flicking between the locked door and the radio on the desk. The radio was silent, just a faint hiss of static, and then, suddenly, Harris's real voice cracked through, shaky but urgent. "Ethan, listen carefully. I'm still near Shaft 4. Stay in the control room. Do not open the door." My stomach dropped. That wasn't him outside. Whoever, or whatever it was, it went quiet after. The message came through like it knew I knew. For a few seconds, there was nothing but my breathing and the low hum of the ventilation fan overhead. And then I heard it again. Soft, dragging footsteps outside the control room, moving past the door, slow and deliberate, like whoever was out. They wanted me to know they were leaving, though, but not too far. I stood perfectly still, every muscle locked, waiting for the sound to fade completely before reaching for the radio. My voice cracked when I whispered, "Harris, there's someone outside the control room pretending to be you." There was A long pause, broken only by faint static, before Harris finally replied, "Don't talk to it, don't answer it, don't even let it hear you breathing. Just stay put, kid." I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but something in his tone stopped me cold. Harris knew exactly what was happening and he didn't want to explain it. Or maybe he couldn't. I glanced at the paper with the scratched-out rules lying on the desk. My eyes locked on that faint pencil scrawl beneath Rule #7, barely visible, under the fluorescent light. "If they call your name, but it isn't them." I remembered reading it earlier, thinking it sounded like paranoia. But now, standing there in the silence with my heart racing, I wasn't so sure anymore. I sat back in the chair, my palms sweaty, my ears straining for every sound, and that's when I noticed something else. Something far worse. The camera feeds. On the monitor showing Shaft 6, the deepest and oldest part of the mine, a figure was standing completely still in the center of the tunnel. It wasn't moving. It wasn't carrying a light. And yet somehow, in the grainy black and white feed, I could see its outline perfectly. It was tall. Too tall to be Harris or any other miner. Its head nearly brushing the low ceiling of the tunnel. Its arms hanging unnaturally long at its sides. I leaned forward, squinting at the screen, and that's when it tilted its head. Not toward the camera, but up as though it knew I was watching. My chest tightened, panic flaring in my gut, and I grabbed the radio again. "Harris, check Shaft 6 right now. There's someone down there." No response. Just static, louder this time, almost crackling like interference, was bleeding through. I tapped the side of the radio, but the signal was gone. I looked back at the monitor. The figure had vanished. My stomach twisted as I scanned the other camera feeds. Tunnel 3, clear. Tunnel 5, clear. Tunnel 7. A faint flicker of movement at the far edge of the screen. There 1 second and gone the next, like a shadow caught in headlights. My breathing picked up. I couldn't sit here any longer without doing something, without knowing where Harris was or what the hell was walking around down here. Against every ounce of common sense, I unlatched the control room door and stepped into the hallway, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The tunnels were quiet, oppressively quiet, the kind of silence that feels thick, heavy, like the walls themselves are listening. The only sounds were the faint buzzing of the overhead lights and the distant hum of the ventilation system, deep and low like an animal breathing beneath the earth. I called softly into the radio. "Harris, you copy?" Still nothing. I followed the main corridor toward the elevator shaft, the beam of my flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. My boots crunched on the gravel floor, each sound too loud in the suffocating silence. As I passed Shaft 5, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a brief flash of something pale against the dark walls. I froze, whipped the flashlight toward it, and the beam illuminated a patch of damp rock, glistening under condensation. Nothing else. No one there. My breath fogged in the cold air as I turned away, telling myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me after everything Harris had said. But then I reached Shaft 6 and my stomach dropped. The entrance was blocked off by a rusted gate bolted into the rock, covered in warning signs so old the paint had started to peel. Danger. Shaft sealed 1997. And yet, in the thin layer of coal dust coating the concrete floor in front of it, I saw fresh boot prints. They led straight up to the gate and stopped. I knelt down, tracing the marks with my flashlight, and noticed something stranger. The prints were deep at first, like someone was walking normally, but as they approached the gate, the weight shifted, the heel marks disappeared, and the last 2 prints were nothing but long, dragging streaks like whatever was leaving them had been pulled into the darkness beyond the bars. I backed away slowly, pulse pounding in my ears, when my radio crackled to life again. But this time the voice coming through wasn't Harris's. Ethan. It was faint, warped, like someone speaking underwater. "Come down. Help me." I nearly dropped the radio. It sounded like Harris, but off. Wrong. Too slow. Stretched in a way no human voice should sound. My throat went dry, and without thinking, I shouted back, "Where are you?" Instantly, I regretted it. Silence filled the tunnels, pressing in from every direction, suffocating. Then from deep inside Shaft 6, I heard it, a faint scraping, like nails dragging across stone, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere far below. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own boots, when the real Harris's voice finally exploded through the radio, loud and urgent. "Ethan, stay away from Shaft 6. That's not me down there. Get back to the control room now." My whole body went cold. I turned and ran, boots pounding against the floor, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly across the walls. The tunnels blurred past me as I sprinted, lungs burning, heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't dare look back, but as I rounded the corner toward the control room, I heard it again. Footsteps behind me, soft but fast, matching my pace exactly. I burst through the control room door, slammed it shut and locked it, my chest heaving, sweat dripping into my eyes. The radio was still clutched in my shaking hands when Harris came through again, his voice lower now, strained but steady. "Listen to me, Ethan. No matter what happens tonight, no matter what you hear, you stay in that control room. Keep the lights on, keep the door locked, and if anyone calls your name, you don't answer. Do you understand?" I swallowed hard, forcing out a shaky, "Yeah." And then the radio went silent again. I sat there, gripping the flashlight, staring at the scratched-out Rule #7 on the paper in front of me. And for the first time since taking this job, I finally understood why someone wanted it erased. Because tonight, down here in the dark, something knew my name. I sat in the control room for what felt like hours, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached, my ears straining for any sound beyond the constant buzzing of the lights above me. The scratched-out Rule #7 lay on the desk. The faint pencil scrawl beneath it burned into my mind. If they call your name, but it isn't them. It wasn't paranoia anymore. Something down here knew my name, and whatever it was, it wanted me to follow it. I tried the radio again, whispering, "Harris, do you copy?" The static hissed for several seconds before his voice finally cut through, strained and rough. "I'm still near Shaft 4, stay where you are. Lock the door, and for God's sake, don't listen to anything else you hear." His tone made my stomach knot because Harris didn't sound confused. He sounded afraid. That scared me more than anything. I stared at the monitors in front of me, flipping between camera feeds, forcing myself to focus on something. Anything other than the memory of that voice outside the door. The grainy black and white images showed mostly empty tunnels, damp walls slick with condensation. But when I checked the feed for camera 12, the one watching the main corridor past Shaft 6, I froze. There was someone standing there. First I thought maybe it was Harris, maybe one of the other miners on a late shift, but then I realized the figure wasn't wearing a helmet or carrying a light. They just stood in the shadows at the edge of the camera's range, motionless, facing the wall like they were listening to something deep inside the rock. I leaned closer to the screen, holding my breath, when suddenly, the figure's head twisted slowly, unnaturally, until it was facing the camera without moving its body. Even through the low resolution, I felt its eyes lock onto mine, and I yanked my headset off instinctively. When I looked back a few seconds later, the figure was gone. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I grabbed the radio, but before I could press the button, Harris's voice came through first, tense and rapid. "Ethan, listen carefully. I just saw something near Shaft 6. Whatever you do, do not go near it." My voice cracked as I answered, "I know. I saw it too." "What the hell is going on down here, Harris?" Silence. A long pause, then a low sigh. Later, just stay in the room. I tried to stay put. I really did. But after 10 minutes, the silence pressed down so heavily it felt like the walls were closing in on me. The monitors weren't helping either. On camera 12, static suddenly flickered across the feed. White noise swallowing the tunnel view for a few seconds before the image returned. And this time, the camera angle had shifted slightly, like someone had bumped it. but there was no one in sight. That was when I noticed something in the corner of the frame. Faint smudges on the tunnel wall. Long dark streaks smeared down toward the floor like handprints sliding into the coal dust. My pulse spiked. I had to know what was happening, even if every rational part of me screamed to stay put. Against better judgment, I unlocked the control room door and stepped back into the corridor. The air was colder here, damp, thick with the smell of coal dust and wet stone. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rails embedded in the ground where old coal carts used to run, abandoned tools leaning against the walls, and water dripping rhythmically from above. I kept the radio close to my chest and whispered, "Harris, I'm heading toward Shaft 6. I just want to see what's going on." No response. I moved slowly, every step crunching on the loose gravel beneath my boots, every sound amplified by the emptiness of the mine. The silence wasn't natural. It felt alive somehow, like it was holding its breath, waiting. When I finally reached the sealed gate at Shaft 6, my stomach dropped. The heavy steel bars were bent slightly outward, like something had forced its way out, not in. My flashlight shook as I scanned the ground and saw the same streaks I'd spotted on the camera feed, fresh against the dusty floor, trailing away. From the gate and down an unmarked access tunnel I didn't even know existed. A broken warning sign leaned against the wall, barely legible under layers of grime. Authorized personnel only. Sealed after incident 1997. I crouched down, tracing one of the dark streaks with my light, when the radio on my shoulder crackled suddenly. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight, but it wasn't Harris this time. It was that same warped voice from earlier, muffled, distorted, like someone speaking underwater. "Ethan, help me. It's stuck. It's so dark." My chest went tight. It sounded like Harris, but wrong. Too slow, stretched somehow, like the words didn't quite fit. I clutched the radio and forced myself to breathe. Then from behind the gate I heard a single, deliberate knock. My stomach clenched. One knock, then another, then a third. Rule #3 slammed into my brain. If you hear knocking from inside a sealed shaft, do not respond. I froze in place, holding my breath, counting silently in my head, willing myself to back away. But then the voice came again, louder now, closer. "Ethan, it's me. Harris, open the gate." I raised the radio with shaking hands, whispering, "If that's you, tell me something only you'd know." Silence. 5 long seconds. Then the voice answered, flat and wrong. "The rules. Follow the rules. Open the gate." That was all I needed to hear. I turned to leave, heart racing, when the real Harris's voice exploded through the radio, rough and panicked. "Ethan, don't listen. I'm on level 3. Stay away from Shaft 6. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. Behind me, clutching the flashlight so tight my hand cramped, the warped voice on the radio cut off instantly, like it had been listening and realized its cover was blown. I didn't wait to see what came next. I sprinted back down the corridor, boots pounding, light bouncing wildly over the jagged walls. My breath came in ragged bursts, sweat running down my neck. When I finally reached the control room, I slammed the door, locked it, and collapsed into the chair, chest heaving. I tried to steady my breathing, but then I heard it again. A faint, deliberate knock, not on the sealed gate this time, but on the door right in front of me. 3 slow beats, metal on metal. My throat went dry. I forced myself not to move, not to breathe, staring at the door like it might burst open at any second. The knock stopped. Then came a soft, dragging sound, like someone running their fingertips along the steel doorframe, tracing it, feeling for weak spots. I reached for the radio, but before I could speak, Harris came through again, his voice strained but steady. "Stay put, Ethan. Lock the door. Turn off your flashlight and don't make a sound. I'll explain everything when I get there." I flicked off my light, plunging the room into darkness. My ears rang with the silence, and then, barely audible over my pounding heartbeat, I heard something just outside the door. A breath, long, slow, too close. I clenched my jaw. gripping the flashlight like a weapon, praying it would just go away. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever was in Shaft 6 wasn't trapped anymore. And it knew exactly where I was. I sat there in complete darkness, barely daring to breathe, clutching the flashlight in my hand so tightly my fingers cramped, and I tried to convince myself that I imagined the breath outside the door, but deep down, I knew I didn't. Something was there. I listened for what felt like forever, waiting for the next knock or scrape, but all I heard was my own pulse hammering in my ears. Then, suddenly, the radio on my chest crackled softly, and Harris's voice came through in a whisper. "Ethan, I'm 5 minutes away. Don't make a sound. Keep the lights off, and if you hear anything, you stay put, understand?" I whispered back, barely audible. "Yeah." And then the static swallowed his voice again. I waited, trying to slow my breathing, my eyes locked on the faint glow of the monitors. One by one, the camera feeds flickered back on after the earlier static, but the images weren't comforting. If anything, they made my skin crawl. On the Shaft 6 feed, the sealed gate was wide open. My heart stopped. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was seeing things, but when I leaned in closer, I could see it clearly. The heavy steel gate, bent outward more than before, one hinge twisted, coal dust scattered in a wide arc on the floor beyond it. Something had forced its way through. I grabbed the radio, whispering frantically, "Harris, the gate's open. The gate at Shaft 6 is open." But there was no response, just faint static. I tried to convince myself to stay in the control room like Harris told me, but curiosity, mixed with dread, clawed at my chest, and after a few minutes of fighting with myself, I picked up my flashlight, unlocked the door, and stepped into the hallway. The air was heavier now, damp and dense, and the silence had an edge to it, like the whole mine was holding its breath. I moved slowly, my boots crunching softly on the gravel floor, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness in sharp, trembling slices. As I passed the elevator, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Fresh scratches on the wall, long vertical marks carved deep into the steel panels, jagged and uneven, like someone had dragged a piece of machinery across them, but too narrow to be from tools. I ran my gloved fingertips across one and shivered. The metal edges were curled outward as if something had clawed its way up. I kept moving, forcing myself not to think about it, until I reached Shaft 6. The gate was hanging loose. One chain snapped, one hinge barely clinging to the stone wall. The warning signs, faded red lettering on rusted metal, swung gently, creaking softly in the stale air. My flashlight beam shook as I aimed it into the darkness beyond the gate. The unmarked tunnel stretched far ahead, walls jagged and damp, the ceiling low enough that I could see condensation dripping slowly onto the coal-black floor. For a second, I thought I heard something deeper inside. Faint footsteps, soft and measured. But when I killed my own breathing and listened harder, the sound stopped. I reached for my radio again, whispering, "Harris, where are you?" This time his voice came back instantly, low but firm. "I see you on the cameras. Back away from the gate, Ethan, do it now." I took one step backward, but then I noticed something else. On the ground just past the opening, I spotted a small object glinting faintly under the weak light, a helmet. I crouched, leaning forward just enough to see it clearly. It was covered in coal dust, cracked along the edge, and a name had been scrawled across the side in faded white paint, M. Turner. I froze. That was the name on one of the missing miners from the 1997 incident I'd seen in the old reports. My throat went dry. I whispered into the radio, "Harris, Turner's helmet is here." But this time, Harris didn't reply immediately. When he finally did, his voice sounded strained, quieter than before. "Leave it there. Don't touch anything near Shaft 6. That's where they..." He stopped abruptly, the line cutting into static. I stood up, scanning the floor around the helmet, and that's when I noticed the tracks. At first I thought they were boot prints, like someone had been walking barefoot through coal dust, but the longer I stared, the less sense they made. The shape was wrong. The impressions were too long, too thin, like someone had dragged the ball of their foot but lifted their toes unnaturally high, and there weren't just one set of tracks. There were several. They crisscrossed, leading deeper into the sealed shaft, and my stomach clenched tighter with every second I stared at them. That's when the radio popped again. But this time, the voice wasn't Harris's. "Ethan," it whispered soft and low, warped and wet like it was bubbling up from deep underwater. "Come help us. It's dark. We're cold." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice sounded familiar but not right, like someone had recorded Harris and slowed it down, stripped the life out of it, and played it back distorted. My hand trembled as I raised the radio, not answering, and then, faint but clear, I heard a sound from inside the shaft, a soft knock. 1, 2, 3. Deliberate, sharp, metallic. My chest tightened instantly, the memory of the rules flashing through my mind. If you hear knocking from inside a sealed shaft, do not respond. I bit my tongue hard, forcing myself to stay silent, but the knocks kept going. Faster now, overlapping. 5, 6, 7. And then they stopped abruptly, replaced by something far worse. Breathing, slow comma, ragged, just inside the tunnel beyond, the broken gate. I stepped back without realizing it, my flashlight beam shaking violently as I tried to steady my hands. And that's when I saw movement. Deep in the blackness of Shaft 6, just at the edge of the light, something shifted. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but then it stepped forward, one slow, dragging step at a time. My stomach lurched as the light caught part of its shape. Long, thin arms coated in soot, skin pale beneath the coal dust, joints bent at angles that didn't look natural. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, and reached for the radio again, hissing into it. "Harris, it's here, something's in the shaft." Harris's voice cut back, sharp and urgent now. "Back away, Ethan, lock yourself in the control room and don't make a sound. I'm on my way." I turned and bolted, boots pounding the gravel, my breath ragged and shallow. As I ran, I heard something behind me, quick, uneven footsteps scraping across stone, echoing down the tunnel, keeping pace with me for several agonizing seconds before fading into silence again. I didn't stop until I was back in the control room, slamming the door shut and twisting the lock hard until it clicked into place. My chest heaved as I collapsed into the chair, hands shaking violently, trying to process what I'd just seen. Then, I remembered the old incident reports locked in the cabinet behind me. My hands moved before I could think, yanking open the drawer and pulling out the yellowed file labeled Shaft 6, Incident Report 1997. I skimmed through the pages, my eyes darting over phrases written hastily in red pen. 3 miners unaccounted for, bodies never recovered. Last audio transmission recorded deep below Shaft 6, rhythmic knocks followed by name-calling. Secondary search aborted after 2 rescuers reported hearing voices of missing men calling for help. Voices later confirmed impossible, due to confirmed fatalities. All further exploration prohibited, tunnel sealed indefinitely. At the bottom of the report, underlined twice in shaky handwriting, was one final note. Rule #7 added, "If you hear them calling you, it's not them." I dropped the file, my chest tight, a lump forming in my throat. That confirmed it. Someone had scratched the rule out later, but originally it was a warning. One they didn't want new hires like me to read. Before I could process that, the lights in the control room flickered once, twice, and then cut out completely, plunging me into pitch-black darkness. For a few seconds, there was silence, just the sound of my panicked breathing, and then I heard it again. The faint, wet voice through the radio, whispering my name closer this time. "Ethan, open the door." The radio went dead after that last whisper, leaving only the faint hiss of static, and I sat frozen in the pitch-black control room, trying to steady my breathing while gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles burned. My heart felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest, each beat louder than the last, and for a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to move. Somewhere out in the tunnels, I thought I heard something shift. Soft gravel crunching under weight. Slow and measured, just beyond the range of my ears. I flicked on my flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the darkness, casting harsh shadows against the control panels and walls. and instantly regretted it because the light made me feel exposed, like whatever was out there now knew exactly where I was. Then finally the radio crackled back to life. "Ethan," Harris's voice came through, ragged, breathless, urgent. "I'm right outside Shaft 5. Stay put. Don't open the door until you hear 3 knocks, my rhythm, not theirs. You understand me?" I swallowed hard and whispered back, "Yeah," my voice shaking more than I wanted it to, and clutched the flashlight tighter. Harris was close, but so was something else, and I wasn't sure which would reach me first. The seconds dragged like hours, every creak and hum in the mine amplified into something unbearable. I strained my ears and thought I heard footsteps again, but I couldn't tell if they were Harris's or if they belonged to something else mimicking him. Then, from somewhere deep inside the mine, faint but distinct, came 3 slow metallic knocks. My breath caught in my throat, my fingers locked around the door handle. Was that Harris? No, the pattern was wrong. They were evenly spaced, too deliberate, like someone practicing the sound rather than signaling. I stood frozen, waiting, praying Harris would come soon, when, finally, another set of knocks came. 3 short, rapid, sharp taps, exactly like Harris had taught me earlier during orientation. I hesitated, counted silently in my head, and whispered to myself, "It's him," before carefully unlocking the door and pulling it open just wide enough for Harris to slip inside. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him, face pale, shirt soaked with sweat, helmet light casting sharp shadows across his hollow expression. "Lock it," he hissed, shoving the door closed behind him. I slid the bolt shut, and he leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, wiping soot from his forehead with a trembling hand. I started to speak, but he raised a finger to his lips, listening intently, head tilted slightly toward the hallway. For a moment we both stood there silent, straining to hear anything over the faint hum of the ventilation system. Then, softly, from far away came the sound of footsteps, slow and dragging, scraping lightly across gravel and stone. Harris whispered without looking at me, "It knows where we are." I swallowed hard, whispering back, "What the hell is it, Harris?" He stared straight ahead for a long moment, jaw tight, before finally speaking, his voice low, flat, controlled. "Back in '97, there was a collapse at Shaft 6. 3 miners went missing. That's what the reports say, but it wasn't just a collapse. When rescue teams went down there, they said they heard voices, the missing men calling for help. But they were already dead, Ethan. Their bodies were buried under 60 feet of rock. And yet..." He trailed off, rubbing his hand over his face before continuing. "The team said they saw shadows moving down there, deep in the cracks. Something else was in the mine. Something older than these tunnels. That's why they sealed it off. That's what Rule #7 was about," I whispered, barely able to form words. "Why scratch it out?" Harris looked at me, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Because if new hires knew exactly what was down here, no one would take the job." Before I could respond, the lights overhead flickered violently, buzzing loud, and then the control room was plunged back into total darkness. I clicked on my flashlight instantly, the beam bouncing across the walls, and Harris grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "Turn it off," he breathed into my ear. "Don't let it see us." I hesitated, confusion flooding me, but his grip tightened. "Turn it off." Reluctantly, I killed the light, and we stood there in darkness so absolute it felt suffocating. That's when I heard it, breathing soft and wet just outside the door. It lasted only a few seconds before the radio on the desk erupted with static so loud I nearly dropped my flashlight. Then a voice came through, soft and ragged, almost identical to Harris's. "Ethan, open the door. We have to go." Harris reached across me and yanked the radio cord straight from the console, killing the sound immediately. We waited, listening, barely daring to breathe. The silence stretched long enough that I started to think whatever it was had moved on, until the doorknob rattled once, twice, 3 times, slow and deliberate, like fingers curling against the steel. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out, and then the rattling stopped. Harris leaned close and whispered, "It's testing us." We stayed locked inside for what felt like hours but must have only been minutes. until the faint hum of the ventilation system came back on, signaling that power had returned to at least part of the mine. Harris motioned for me to grab my helmet and follow him. "We can't stay here," he said, voice clipped, urgent. "If it knows where we're sitting ducks." Reluctantly, I followed him into the hallway, my flashlight turned low, sweeping the walls and ceiling. The tunnels felt different now, heavier somehow, like the air itself was pressing down on us. As we passed Shaft 5, I noticed something that made me stop dead. Fresh scratches on the concrete, deep grooves carved into the stone floor, leading from the sealed entrance of Shaft 6 down the main corridor, as if something had dragged itself along the ground. Harris saw me staring and said, "Don't look too long. It notices when you look." My stomach churned as we moved quickly but quietly toward the elevator. But when we rounded the corner, Harris stopped so abruptly I nearly collided with him. He raised a hand, signaling me to stay silent, and then slowly pointed his flashlight toward the far end of the tunnel. At first I couldn't see anything, but then the light caught movement. A figure, tall and hunched, crouched low to the ground like it was sniffing the concrete, its long arms braced against the floor. My skin went cold as I realized it was facing away from us, but its head turned unnaturally far, slow and deliberate, until it was looking directly over its shoulder in our direction. Harris grabbed my arm and whispered, "Back." Slowly. We retreated step by careful step, keeping our lights pointed at the floor to avoid drawing attention. But just as we rounded another corner, a loud metallic clang echoed through the tunnel, sharp and jarring. Harris cursed under his breath, and instantly, we heard it start moving. Fast. The scraping sound of its limbs hitting the walls as it lunged forward, the echo of its dragging feet, the sudden rush of something far too quick for its size. Harris shoved me hard and yelled, "Run!" I sprinted, lungs burning, boots hammering the gravel, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the damp stone. The sound behind us was deafening now, claws raking against walls, deep guttural breaths, closing in. Harris barked directions, leading me through winding tunnels I didn't recognize, and finally shoved me through a narrow maintenance hatch barely wide enough for us to squeeze inside. We slammed it shut, locking the rusted latch from the inside, both of us gasping for breath in the suffocating dark dot. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Our only sounds the ragged inhale and exhale of panic. Finally, Harris leaned close and whispered, "That's what happened to Turner and the others in '97. That's what Rule #7 was warning us about. It can sound like them, walk like them, but it isn't them." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I whispered back, "Then what does it want?" Harris shook his head slowly, his breath trembling, and answered in a voice barely audible, "It wants us to follow it back down." Before I could respond, there was a sudden loud bang on the maintenance hatch, the whole metal door shuddering violently. Once, twice, then silence. Harris mouthed, "Don't move." We sat there in darkness, motionless, waiting, hoping it would pass when the radio on my chest, the one I thought Harris had disabled, crackled faintly, and the same distorted voice whispered through, almost playful this time, "Ethan, it's safe now. Come out." I sat there in the pitch-black maintenance hatch, my back pressed against the cold steel wall, my chest heaving as I tried to control my breathing, and I stared at Harris's faint silhouette barely 2 feet away from me. The air inside was heavy and damp, laced with the sharp tang of coal dust, and the silence pressed against my ears so hard it almost rang. That faint, distorted voice had just come through my radio, even though Harris had ripped the damn cord out minutes ago, and we both knew what that meant. Whatever was out there could mimic the signal, mimic Harris, mimic anything it wanted. I clenched the flashlight in my hand but kept it off, my palms slick with sweat. Harris leaned close, his lips barely moving, and whispered, "Don't answer it, no matter what it says." I nodded, throat too dry to speak, and we sat there listening, waiting, praying that whatever was on the other side of the hatch would get bored and leave us alone. Then came the first knock. It was soft, almost delicate, just 3 light taps, against the steel, evenly spaced, perfectly rhythmic. My stomach twisted because Harris had just taught me his knock pattern, and this was exactly the same. Exactly. I looked at him, wide-eyed, but he shook his head violently, his index finger pressed against his lips. We didn't move. Another set of knocks came, slightly louder this time, more insistent, and then, after a pause, we heard his voice. Not the distorted, watery version we'd heard before, but Harris's voice exactly, sharp and impatient. "Ethan, it's me. Open up." My skin went cold. Harris sat right in front of me, breathing heavily in the dark, shaking his head slowly, and whispered so faintly I barely heard him. "That's not me." We waited, unmoving, until the footsteps finally faded down the corridor outside the hatch, slow and dragging, heading toward the deeper tunnels beneath Shaft 6. Harris leaned closer and whispered, "We can't stay here. If it knows we're hiding, it'll keep circling back. We need to move. Carefully." I wanted to argue, to tell him we should stay put like the rules said, but the look in his eyes made me swallow my words. He was terrified, and if Harris was scared, I knew it was bad. We slipped out of the hatch quietly, our boots barely scraping the floor, the damp air clinging to my skin like a second layer. The tunnels here were older than the rest of the mine, carved decades ago. The walls jagged and uneven, reinforced with warped steel beams that dripped condensation in the dim light. I kept my flashlight beam low, sweeping only a few feet ahead, careful not to catch anything unexpected in the distance, but the shadows still danced unnaturally at the edges of my vision. Harris led us down a narrow corridor I hadn't seen before, an unmarked service tunnel branching off from the main shaft. And as soon as we stepped into it, I noticed the temperature drop. The air here was colder, thinner, and for the first time since I arrived at the mine, I realized how shallow my breathing had become. It wasn't just my anxiety. The oxygen levels were lower this deep down. After about 50 yards, we came to a locked steel door covered in dust and grime, half buried behind discarded mining carts and a stack of rotting wooden pallets. Harris pulled a keyring from his belt, flipping through them until he found a small rusted one, and slid it into the lock with a slow, deliberate turn. The door creaked open, the hinges groaning in protest, and we stepped into a cramped chamber lined with old filing cabinets and crates stacked against the walls. A single emergency light buzzed faintly overhead, casting the room in a sickly orange glow. Harris shut the door behind us and gestured for me to help him move a heavy metal cabinet across it. Once we were sealed inside, he leaned against one of the desks, exhaling shakily. "This," he said quietly, "is where they kept the incident reports." I looked around the room, scanning the cabinets, each one labeled with faded stickers. Safety logs, accident reports, personnel files. Dust clung to everything, thick enough that it looked like no one had set foot in here for decades. Harris, crouched by one of the lower drawers, yanked it open and pulled out a large black binder. He flipped through the yellowing pages quickly, muttering under his breath, until he stopped at one marked with a red tab. He turned the book so I could see, and there it was. Black Hollow Mine. Incident Report, October 14th, 1997. My stomach tightened as I read through it, scanning the official statements from survivors and rescue teams. According to the file, there had been 6 miners trapped when a cave-in blocked Shaft 6, and 3 were recovered alive 2 days later. But the other 3, Turner, Cole, and Ramirez, were never found. That part I already knew. What I didn't know, what wasn't mentioned in the publicly released reports, was that rescue crews reported hearing knocking patterns from deep below the rockfall days after the men were presumed dead. One searcher's handwritten note in the margin made my blood run cold. "The voices sound like them, but they're not. Ramirez's body recovered in pieces. No rescue attempt beyond level 7. Orders came from above." I looked up at Harris, my voice barely steady. "So it's been here since then?" He nodded slowly, rubbing his temples. "Longer. This mine was built on older tunnels, from before anyone kept records. They used to say Black Hollow ran through the veins of something, ancient, buried under this mountain, but nobody listened. They kept digging anyway." Before I could respond, the emergency light above us flickered violently, buzzing louder, and then we both heard it. Faint, soft footsteps outside the door, pacing slowly back and forth, like something deciding whether to come in. We froze, hardly breathing, and then a single sharp knock echoed against the steel. Once, twice, 3 times. Harris squeezed his eyes shut, mouthing silently, "Don't move." A minute passed. 2. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, and then the footsteps moved away, fading gradually until they were swallowed by the tunnels. Harris waited another full minute before lowering his voice. "We can't stay in one place anymore. If it's tracking us by sound, we have to get higher up before it loops back." He grabbed the binder, stuffed it into his bag, and motioned for me to follow. We slipped back into the corridor, moving as quietly as possible, but almost immediately I knew something was wrong. The hum of the ventilation system was gone again, and the air felt heavier, thicker, like the oxygen was being pulled out of the tunnels themselves. My chest ached with each shallow breath, and every step forward felt harder than the last. I opened my mouth to whisper to Harris, but he held up a hand sharply, signaling me to stop. That's when I heard it. Somewhere up ahead, faint at first but growing clearer, came a wet, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across stone, followed by soft, uneven breathing that wasn't ours. Harris turned off his flashlight instantly and crouched low, motioning for me to do the same. We waited in total darkness, listening. The sound came closer, slow but relentless, until it was only a few yards away. And then, faintly, I heard it speak. "Harris. Ethan. Help us." The voice was wrong. 2 layered, like 3 voices speaking at once, overlapping imperfectly, each one slightly out of sync. I clenched my fists, forcing myself not to respond, even as cold sweat trickled down my neck. The sound lingered for a few seconds, heavy and wet, before the footsteps receded again, this time deeper into the mine, toward the sealed gate at shaft 6. Harris leaned close, his breath warm against my ear, and whispered, "We're running out of time." We started moving again, faster now, but carefully, keeping our lights low and steps silent. Every creak of our boots on loose gravel felt deafening in the quiet. When we finally reached a junction where the tunnel split 3 ways, Harris hesitated, looking down each path, muttering something under his breath about old maps and maintenance routes. That's when a sound behind us made both of us spin instantly. A loud metallic clang, like steel hitting steel, echoing violently through the corridor. We both froze, hearts pounding, waiting for movement, but the tunnel behind us stayed, empty, silent, almost unnaturally so. Then, from the darkness ahead, a shape moved. At first, it was just a blur at the edge of my flashlight beam, but as it stepped forward, the details came into focus. The height, the twisted limbs, the pale skin streaked black with coal dust, and the way its head tilted too far to the side, almost unnaturally flexible, as though the bones weren't holding it together properly. I couldn't breathe. It was watching us, motionless, its chest rising and falling in shallow, deliberate breaths. Harris grabbed my sleeve and mouthed, "Don't run." We backed away slowly, inch by inch, the thing standing perfectly still, its body half hidden in the shadows. Then, in one fluid, unnatural motion, it dropped to the ground and began crawling toward us, its limbs jerking erratically, fingers scraping against stone, making a high-pitched, teeth-grinding sound as sparks flicked off the steel rails beneath it. Harris hissed, "Move!" and we bolted, sprinting down the left-hand tunnel without looking back. My lungs burned, my boots slipped on the damp floor, and somewhere behind us, that horrible scraping sound followed, relentless, closing the distance with unnatural speed. We rounded another corner, Harris pulling me by the arm, and spotted a rusted ladder bolted into the wall leading up into an old ventilation shaft. "Climb!" he barked, shoving me upward. I scrambled up the rungs as fast as I could, my hands slipping on the wet metal, my breath ragged, heart hammering so hard I thought I'd pass out. Below me, Harris started climbing too, and just as I reached the ledge at the top, I glanced down and saw it. That thing had reached the base of the ladder, its head tilted up, face hidden in shadow, motionless for one terrifying second before it started climbing after us. Fast. I climbed faster than I thought possible, my boots slipping on the wet steel rungs, hands shaking as I hauled myself up the old ventilation shaft. My lungs burned, each breath ragged and shallow, the damp air thick with the stench of rust and coal dust. Below me, Harris was climbing hard too, his boots clanging against the ladder, but what terrified me wasn't the sound of his breathing or my own. It was the scraping coming from even lower, the unnatural clatter of bone and metal on steel as the thing beneath us followed, its movements frantic and jerky, faster than anything that size had the right to be. I risked a glance down, just for a split second, and instantly wished I hadn't. The beam of Harris's helmet light caught its face, or what should have been a face, but instead of features, there was just pale, raw flesh stretched thin, streaked black with coal dust, its mouth hanging slightly open in a silent, unnatural grin as it climbed hand over hand, its limbs bending wrong. Too many joints where there shouldn't be any. I tore my eyes away, forcing myself upward, my chest tight with panic. "Faster!" Harris hissed below me, his voice sharp but trembling, and I didn't need to be told twice. We reached the top of the ladder and crawled into a narrow steel shaft, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through. My knees scraped against rusted metal as I dragged myself forward, the thin, stale air inside carrying the faint echo of our shallow breaths. Harris was right behind me, and below us, somewhere in the dark, the thing kept climbing. Its claws, or whatever it used, scraped violently against the ladder, and then the sound stopped. That silence was worse than the noise. We both froze, our bodies tense, listening. Harris leaned close, whispering so softly I barely heard him. "Keep going, don't stop, whatever you do, don't look back." The shaft was narrow, suffocating, the steel walls slick with condensation, and every few feet I passed small vents cut into the side, some clogged with dust, others open and yawning into blackness. I couldn't help glancing at them, afraid of what might be watching from the other side, but all I saw was darkness and the faint reflection of my own trembling light. The shaft bent sharply to the left, and as we crawled around the corner, I heard it again, the sound of metal groaning below us like something pulling itself into the vent. Harris heard it too because I felt his hand press against my boot, holding me in place. We stopped, silent, our breaths shallow, and for a few seconds there was nothing. Then from behind us in the shaft came the faint sound of something dragging itself along the steel, slow and steady, each movement deliberate, calculated, and impossibly quiet for something so large. Harris leaned forward, close enough for me to hear his ragged whisper over the pounding of my heart, "Move, Ethan, now." I didn't need to be told twice. We crawled as fast as the cramped space allowed, knees banging against bolts, elbows scraping raw against rusted seams, the sound behind us quickening with each passing second. My breathing grew loud and ragged, but the thing seemed faster than us, gaining inch by inch. The shaft began sloping upward slightly, forcing us to claw our way forward, and I could feel my arms burning, my chest tight, my heartbeat wild in my ears. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked. Then, suddenly, the shaft split into two directions. Harris swore under his breath, grabbing the edge of the junction, shining his light down the left passage, then the right. The left sloped down, steeply into darkness, but the right showed signs of fresh boot scuffs on the metal. Without hesitation, Harris muttered, "Right," and we crawled that way, the sound behind us growing louder, closer, like it knew exactly where we were heading. The shaft opened into a small maintenance cavity barely big enough for the two of us to crouch. A broken fan sat in the corner, its blades rusted solid, and an old inspection panel leaned halfway open, revealing a narrow drop into another section of tunnels below. Harris pulled out his battered map from his vest pocket, scanning it quickly, with his helmet light. "This connects to one of the abandoned upper levels," he whispered, his voice strained. "If we can make it there, we can bypass the main corridors and—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes locking on something behind me. I turned slowly, my stomach sinking, and saw it. Through the vent we'd just crawled out of, maybe 10 feet away, two pale, elongated hands gripped the steel edges, fingers impossibly long, nails jagged and cracked, pulling its head into view. Its eyes, if they were eyes, reflected light like an animal's, faint and glassy, and its head twisted, at an angle no human neck could manage. It didn't move for a few seconds, just watching us, and then, without warning, it slammed both hands into the shaft walls and began dragging itself forward with terrifying speed. "Harris, go!" I shouted, scrambling toward the inspection panel, and together we kicked the rest of it open. Metal clanging loudly against the floor below. Without hesitating, I dropped into the darkness, landing hard on my shoulder, but rolling instinctively to break the fall. Harris hit the ground beside me an instant later, grunting in pain, but we didn't have time to recover. Above us, the thing shrieked. Not loud, but sharp, broken, the sound of tearing metal layered with wet static, and it began forcing its body through the narrow opening, joints cracking, ribs compressing unnaturally as it wriggled through a space no living thing should have fit inside. We bolted into the new tunnel, my flashlight beam swinging wildly over jagged rock walls and collapsed timber supports, our boots splashing through shallow pools of water left from decades of seepage. The air was colder here, heavier somehow, and the faint smell of rot made my stomach turn. As we ran, I noticed faded warning signs nailed crookedly to the walls: restricted zone, collapse risk, and sealed since 1997. My chest tightened at the date. This was part of the level they'd closed after the incident, the one in the reports. "Ethan," Harris gasped between breaths. "This whole section was buried after the rescue attempt failed. They shouldn't have left these tunnels open at all." I wanted to ask why they didn't seal them properly, but I already knew the answer. The mine's management didn't care what was down here. They just cared about the coal dot. We reached a wide chamber, an old storage area filled with broken equipment, collapsed shelves, and rows of rusted lockers standing like tombstones along the far wall. Harris motioned for me to kill my light, and reluctantly I switched it off. We crouched in the shadows, listening, waiting, but the silence was almost worse than the sound. Then faintly I heard it, a soft tapping, irregular, coming from somewhere above us. Harris looked up slowly, his jaw tightening, and shined his light at the ceiling. There, clinging to the pipes like a spider, was the thing. It hung upside down, its limbs splayed unnaturally wide, head cocked at an angle, mouth slightly open as if tasting the air. Its chest expanded and contracted in slow, deliberate breaths, and though we were hidden in darkness, I felt certain it knew exactly where we were. The moment Harris's light touched it, its head snapped violently toward us, and in one unnatural motion, it launched itself from the pipes, landing in a twisted heap on the floor before straightening up with a sickening crack of its joints. We didn't wait. We ran. The tunnels blurred as we sprinted blindly through the darkness, following Harris's lead while my legs screamed and my lungs burned. Behind us, the thing crashed after us, its limbs scraping stone, each movement jerky but fast, impossibly fast. The sound of claws or nails hitting metal reverberating through the narrow corridor. Then suddenly the floor beneath us gave way slightly, the ground sagging under our weight, and Harris grabbed my arm, pulling me away just as a large section collapsed into a black pit below. The noise echoed loudly through the mine, and almost immediately I heard the thing shriek again, furious, its voice warping between tones like it was trying to mimic multiple people at once, fragments of words breaking through the sound. "Harris, Ethan, down, here." We didn't slow down until Harris ducked into a narrow alcove, pushing me hard against the wall as we both killed our lights and crouched in silence. The thing barreled past moments later, its twisted shadow sliding across the rock walls, its dragging steps vanishing down the far end of the corridor. I sat there, gasping for air, my entire body trembling, and Harris leaned in close, whispering in a voice barely audible over my heartbeat. "It's hunting us, and we're running out of places to hide." Before I could respond, the radio on my chest crackled faintly, this time with something new. A voice, soft but unmistakable, came through the static. "Turner, Ramirez, Cole, the missing miners, the ones from the 97 reports." Harris and I stared at each other in the dark, and in that moment, we both knew the same thing. Whatever was down here wasn't just hunting us. It was collecting us. We crouched there in the darkness, our backs pressed against the cold stone, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would shake the tunnel walls, and for a long moment neither of us moved, afraid even to breathe too loudly. The thing's dragging. Steps had faded into the deeper tunnels, swallowed by the echoing silence, but Harris kept his hand up, signaling me to stay still. Sweat ran down my neck despite the chill in the air, and I felt my entire body trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. After what felt like an eternity, Harris leaned in close, his whisper barely audible over the blood rushing in my ears. "It's gone. For now. We move while we can." I nodded, wiping coal dust from my face with a shaky hand, and followed him as he led us through a narrow side corridor. The beam from his helmet light kept low and tight to avoid drawing attention. The tunnels grew older as we went, the steel supports warped and rusting, the air damp and stale, carrying the faint smell of rot and burned plastic. I whispered, "Where are we going?" Harris glanced back at me briefly, his face pale and drawn, before muttering, "There's a room, a control station they shut down after the '97 incident. It's not on the official maps, but if we can get there, we might find out what the hell's been going on." We moved carefully, ducking under low beams, stepping over collapsed rock piles, every sound of loose gravel under our boots sounding deafening in the silence. After several minutes, we reached a narrow stairwell carved directly into the rock, spiraling downward into the dark. Rusted handrails flaked under my touch as we descended, the smell of damp metal growing stronger with every step. And when we finally reached the bottom, I saw a rust-streaked steel door half buried behind debris and abandoned equipment. Harris brushed aside loose stones, revealing an old keypad mounted into the wall next to the door, its buttons coated in grime. He wiped it clean with his sleeve and punched in a code without hesitation. I stared at him, surprised. "How the hell do you know that?" He hesitated a moment before answering quietly. "I've been down here longer than anyone else, kid. There's things about this place management doesn't tell you." The keypad beeped faintly, and with a loud metallic groan, the heavy door unlocked. We slipped inside and pulled it shut behind us, sealing ourselves in a space so quiet and insulated, it was like the tunnels outside no longer existed. The room was small, maybe 10 by 15 feet, lined with rusted filing cabinets and a dusty bank of control panels lit faintly by emergency power. A cracked monitor glowed dim green, its screen filled with rows of static-laced code, and thick cables ran up into the ceiling, disappearing into the rock above. Against one wall, an entire row of black binders sat on a sagging metal shelf, each labeled in faded white paint. Shaft 6, personnel records, audio logs, incident reports, and a final one marked simply, "Rule Protocols." Harris moved quickly, pulling the last binder down and flipping it open on the desk. I leaned over his shoulder, scanning the yellowed pages, and my stomach turned as I read the heading on the first page. Supplemental Rule Addendum, Draft #7, Subject Identification Protocols. Beneath it was a handwritten note, faded but still legible. "Do not engage auditory contact with unidentified entities mimicking personnel voices. These signals are not human. Visual confirmation required. If voice is answered, entity will prioritize caller response over other available subjects." I stared at the note, bile rising in my throat as the reality sank in. Answering the thing meant giving it permission, making myself a target. That explained Rule #7. It wasn't just a warning, it was a survival filter. Harris flipped another page, scanning quickly, and then he stopped on one section entirely underlined in thick black ink. The heading read, "Hazard Source Origin, Internal Memo 1997. The memo detailed something the public never knew. During excavation of Shaft 6, miners broke into an older tunnel, one that wasn't on any geological surveys, and uncovered a cavern containing non-human biological material. I read the line 3 times thinking I misread it, but Harris tapped the page with a grim nod. "They woke something up," he whispered. "They tried to study it, keep it contained, and when it got loose, they lied to everyone. The collapse in '97 wasn't an accident, and it was a cover-up." Before I could respond, a soft crackling sound came from one of the monitors in the corner. Harris turned sharply, adjusting the knobs until the static cleared, and suddenly an old audio file began to play automatically, its label flashing faintly on the broken screen. Audio log #23, recovery attempt. The recording was rough, full of static, but we could make out panicked voices of rescue workers. Movement below us, we've got lights. Jesus Christ, Ramirez, don't go down there. I hear them. They're alive down there, I swear I hear Turner's voice. No, that's not them, everyone out now. Then a scream tore through the speakers, sharp and ragged, followed by a low, wet-breathing sound before the log cut abruptly into silence. I stood frozen, staring at the screen, feeling my entire body go cold. Harris shut the monitor off with a shaky hand, muttering, "That's enough." I barely had time to process what I'd just heard before a sound outside the door froze us both where we stood. It was faint at first, but there was no mistaking it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging footsteps moving down the corridor we'd just come through. Harris turned off his light instantly, plunging the room into near-total darkness, and we crouched low behind the desk, holding our breath. The steps stopped right outside the door, and for a long, agonizing moment there was nothing. Then, softly, came 3 knocks. Perfectly spaced, perfectly rhythmic. Harris looked at me and shook his head violently, mouthing silently, "Don't move, Dot." But then the radio on my chest came alive with static and the thing's voice slid through like oil. "Ethan, Harris, open up. We need to leave now." It was so perfect this time, almost identical to Harris's voice, but there was a faint distortion under the words, a hollow resonance that didn't belong. I clenched my fists, forcing myself not to respond, when another sound came from outside the door, the screech of steel on stone like nails dragging down a wall. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started, and we waited in silence, both of us barely breathing until Harris leaned close and whispered, "It knows." We sat there in darkness for what felt like forever before Harris finally nodded toward the opposite wall, where a rusted service hatch sat half-hidden behind a row of old cabinets. He motioned for me to help, and together we shoved the metal shelf aside as quietly as possible, revealing a narrow shaft barely wide enough for one person at a time. "It leads to an older monitoring station," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We'll lose it in the cross tunnels if we're quiet." He slid the hatch open slowly, the hinges squealing faintly despite his best effort, and we crawled inside, sealing it behind us. The shaft was dark, narrow, suffocating, and for several long minutes we moved silently on hands and knees, careful not to let our boots scrape the metal walls. But then, somewhere far behind us, deep in the tunnels we'd just left, came the sound we both dreaded most. The thing squeezing itself into the shaft, its limbs scraping against steel, jerking forward with unnatural speed. I glanced back just long enough to see its faint reflection in the beam of Harris's helmet light, its pale fingers curling around the hatch frame as it pulled itself inside. My chest tightened, my lungs burning as I whispered, "It's coming." Harris's voice was steady, cold, the kind of calm you only hear from someone who's been living with fear too long. Then we moved faster. The shaft felt endless, a narrow coffin of steel and rust where every breath echoed back at us, and I could hear Harris's strained breathing just ahead of me as we crawled as fast as the tight space allowed, our elbows scraping against the cold metal, the damp air pressing down like a weight on my chest. Behind us I could hear it moving, the sound of claws or bones or whatever it used to drag itself forward, scraping against steel in fast, jerky bursts, stopping for a moment, then starting again, closer each time. My throat was dry, my heart hammering so hard I thought the sound alone would give us away, but I kept crawling, trying to match Harris's pace, my knees aching as they slammed into the ridged panels of the shaft. The space grew hotter as we pushed deeper, the air dense and heavy, and my chest burned as if the oxygen itself was thinning, forcing me to take shallow, panicked breaths. My mind screamed at me to look back, but I couldn't risk it, couldn't let my flashlight beam land on its face again, not after what I saw earlier. Harris reached a junction in the shaft and paused for half a second, shining his helmet light down both paths before muttering hoarsely, "Left," and I followed him, Without hesitation, the shaft sloped down sharply, forcing us to crawl lower, nearly on our bellies, and I felt water soaking into my sleeves as condensation dripped from the overhead pipes. Then, faintly, I heard something behind us that froze my blood. Not the scraping, not the dragging, but a voice, soft and deliberate, perfectly imitating Harris. "Ethan, this way. You're going the wrong way." I shut my eyes, clenching my teeth, forcing myself not to answer, and Harris turned his head slightly, whispering under his breath, "Don't listen, it's close." We pushed forward until the shaft widened slightly, opening into a small service chamber just big enough for us to crouch, and I collapsed against the wall, chest heaving, lungs screaming for air. Harris leaned against an old control box, sweat streaking his face beneath the layer of coal dust, and pulled out his folded map, spreading it under the weak glow of his helmet light. His hands trembled slightly as he traced our path with a finger, muttering, "We're here. We're under level 8 now. This leads directly into the auxiliary tunnels. And beyond that." He hesitated, his jaw tightening before he finished the thought. "There's something down there the company never logged. A section they built over and sealed off years before the '97 collapse. If we can make it through, we might find a way out. But we're also heading straight toward the heart of this thing." I stared at him, my voice breaking as I whispered, "What do you mean, the heart of this thing?" Harris wiped his face, his helmet light catching the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes. "They didn't dig this mine into solid rock, Ethan. They built it over something older, something they didn't understand. Shaft 6 hit it first. That's why Rule #7 exists. Once you've heard them, once you answer them, you're marked." Before I could reply, the sound behind us came again, louder this time, scraping and jerking as the thing squeezed through the shaft we'd just left. Harris grabbed my arm and hissed, "Move!" We dropped into the next section of the tunnel system, sliding down a short incline into complete darkness before landing hard on damp rock. The air down here was colder, heavier, and the silence felt wrong, thick and expectant, like the entire place was holding its breath. I turned on my flashlight, keeping the beam low, and for the first time since entering the mine, I saw something that made my stomach twist violently. The walls weren't carved stone here. They were smooth, unnaturally so, lined with faint grooves and strange markings etched deep into the rock, symbols I didn't recognize but that made something primal in me recoil. The floor beneath us wasn't flat either. It dipped slightly toward the center of the chamber, where an old rusted hatch sat flush with the ground, half buried under layers of coal dust and debris. Harris crouched beside it, brushing the dirt away with his gloves, and revealed a faded company insignia, burned into the metal along with a warning label almost entirely scratched away by time. He leaned close, reading what little was left of the letters. "Property of Black Hollow Energy. Classified access only." He turned to me, his expression grim. "This isn't on any of the maps. This is it." With a grunt, he pried the heavy hatch open, the hinges groaning loudly, and a rush of stale, cold air poured up from below, carrying a smell so foul and organic it made me gag. I covered my mouth and nose, and Harris shone his light down the narrow ladder beneath us. "Old research tunnels," he whispered. "They built something here long before they sealed Shaft 6. We're about to find out what." We descended, carefully, the metal rungs slick beneath our boots until we reached the bottom and stepped into a chamber unlike anything I'd seen before in this mine. The walls here were lined with reinforced glass panels, most cracked and fogged with condensation, and inside them, dark shapes slumped unnaturally, their outlines obscured by years of grime and frost. A row of dead monitors sat against one wall, their shattered screens coated with coal dust, and the broken remnants of lab equipment were scattered across the floor. Cracked beakers, overturned tables, rusted restraints bolted into the concrete. My flashlight swept over an old sign hanging crookedly above the far doorway, the faded red letters still barely visible. "Biological Hazard Containment, Level 3. My throat went dry as I whispered, "Harris, what the hell is this place?" He didn't answer at first. He just walked slowly to one of the glass panels, wiped the grime away with his glove, and shone his helmet light inside. My stomach lurched when I saw what was behind the glass. A body. Or what used to be one. It was human once, maybe. But its limbs were too long, the joints wrong, the skin stretched taut and pale beneath veins like black wires. Its jaw hung open slightly, and rows of thin, needle-like teeth lined its mouth. Harris exhaled shakily and muttered, "They were experimenting on the miners." I shook my head, backing away, but he pulled a folder from a nearby shelf, the pages yellowed and curling, flipping through them quickly. He found a section labeled Subject Adaptation, Timeline, and shoved it into my hands. My eyes scanned the words, each one hitting me like a punch. Exposure to unidentified spores resulted in severe neurological and skeletal transformation within 48 hours. Subjects retain partial vocal mimicry but lose higher cognitive function. Containment breach protocols updated following Incident Delta. I dropped the folder, my breath coming fast and shallow. My brain scrambled for answers, but before I could process any of it, Harris grabbed my shoulder hard. "Ethan," he whispered sharply, his voice trembling for the first time since I met him. "Do you understand what this means? The thing. In Shaft 6. It's them. Turner. Cole. Ramirez. All of them." Before I could respond, the lights above us flickered once, twice, and died completely, plunging the chamber into absolute blackness. Harris clicked his helmet light back on, the narrow beam slicing across the room, and froze. One of the glass panels was shattered from the inside. The restraints bolted to the floor were torn loose, twisted metal bent like wire. I felt the cold sink into my bones as we slowly turned our lights toward the far side of the chamber, where fresh tracks smeared through the thick layer of coal dust, leading out into the hallway beyond Dot. Then we heard it, faint at first, but growing steadily, louder, that same distorted voice, broken and layered like multiple recordings stacked on top of each other, whispering from somewhere deep inside the dark tunnels ahead. "Ethan. Harris. Come down. Help us." Harris grabbed my arm, his grip tight, his voice raw and urgent. "Run. Now." We ran. My boots slammed against the damp concrete, splashing through shallow puddles as Harris led me down the narrow corridor beyond the shattered containment chamber, our helmet lights cutting thin beams through the darkness, while the sound behind us grew louder, closer, heavier. That layered voice called my name again, broken and distorted like it was being spoken by 100 throats at once. "Ethan, help us." I forced myself not to respond, not to even glance back, because I knew if I looked, I'd freeze, and freezing down here meant dying. Harris grabbed my arm, yanking me into a side passage, and we pressed ourselves against the wall, holding our breath, while the thing, or things, slid past the junction. I could hear them moving, scraping against the stone, dragging themselves in erratic, jerking bursts like bones snapping inside wet cloth. Harris leaned close, whispering, "They're not hunting us by sight. They listen. Stay silent." My lungs burned as I held my breath, chest aching, sweat running into my eyes. And then, just as suddenly as they'd arrived, the sounds faded deeper into the tunnels, leaving only silence behind. We stood there in the dark for a few seconds longer, before Harris gestured for me to follow. We slipped deeper into the abandoned research wing, past rooms filled with broken lab equipment, rusted steel tables, overturned restraints, and shattered glass panels. Faded biohazard symbols clung to the walls like old scars, and in several rooms I spotted claw marks carved deep into the concrete, each one wider than my hand. My gut twisted with every step. Whoever worked here knew exactly what they were dealing with, and they failed. We reached a larger control room at the far end of the corridor, its thick door hanging open on one twisted hinge. Inside, several monitors were still mounted on the walls, some cracked, others blank, but one in the corner flickered faintly, powered by what must have been an ancient backup system. Harris rushed to it, slapping dust off the console until the feed stabilized into a shaky, grainy recording labeled Shaft 6 Containment Log, October 17, 1997. We both leaned close, and on the monitor, I saw 4 rescue workers in hazmat suits standing outside what looked like the very hatch we'd just come through. Their voices were muffled, but subtitles scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Specimens exhibiting advanced mimicry. Visual confirmation required. Rule #7 established effective immediately. No comms below level 7. Unauthorized voice. Responses increase risk of exposure. Turner and Ramirez confirmed lost. Cole, status unknown. Then the video cut abruptly to static, followed by a single frame so brief I almost missed it. A shape, pale and twisted, pressed against the glass of a containment tank. Its jaw unhinged, its skin rippled unnaturally under something moving beneath. I stumbled back from the console, bile rising in my throat, and whispered, "Harris." This wasn't an accident. They knew. Harris clenched his jaw, his knuckles white around the edge of the console. "They didn't just know, kid. They brought this thing here." Before I could process that, the room plunged into total darkness. The monitor died, the emergency lights went black, and for a heartbeat, there was silence so absolute it crushed the air from my lungs. Then, from somewhere behind us in the hall, a wet dragging sound started. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. Harris killed his helmet light instantly, motioning for me to do the same, and we crouched low against the cold concrete. I heard it crawl into the room behind us, its movements jerky and uneven, claws scraping softly across the steel floor. I felt, rather than saw, when it stopped moving. Then, in the dark, it spoke in my mother's voice. "Ethan, come home." My body locked up, my hands trembling, and for one terrifying second I almost answered. Harris grabbed my arm so hard it hurt and shook his head slowly, mouthing silently, "Don't." The thing lingered for a moment longer, its faint breaths wet and ragged, and then it slid back into the hallway, leaving us in silence again. My lungs screamed for air, but I forced myself to wait, counting the seconds until Harris gave the signal to move. When he did, we slipped back into the corridor and headed toward the only place left unexplored. A reinforced door at the end of the hall, larger than the others, its surface lined with deep scratches that almost looked deliberate, like something had tried to carve its way in, not out. A faded company emblem marked the steel, along with the words, "Black Hollow Project, Primary Archive." Harris found a small control panel beside the door, surprisingly intact despite the decades of decay, and powered it up using an old crank generator stored in a wall box nearby. The panel hummed faintly, lights flickering to life, and the heavy locks disengaged with a deep metallic clunk. The door opened into a chamber so large it made the previous labs feel like storage closets. Rows of servers stretched into the shadows, each coated in decades of dust, their fans silent, their lights dead. But what drew my attention was the far wall, where a massive glass cylinder dominated the room, its interior stained black with residue and cracked along the seams. Old warning labels flaked away under my fingers as I stepped closer, reading them under my breath. Prototype containment, experimental sample 06B. Inside the cylinder, something had been suspended once, something large. Now it was empty. Harris dug through a nearby desk, scattering old files across the floor until he pulled out a faded manila folder stamped Project Black Hollow, Biological Origin Report. He handed it to me with shaking hands, and I scanned the first page under the weak beam of my flashlight. The words didn't make sense at first, and then they did, and the realization made me dizzy. Sample 06B recovered beneath prehistoric sediment at depth marker 11. Analysis confirms non-terrestrial protein structures and unknown neurological architecture. Integration protocols initiated under Directive 7. I looked up at Harris, my voice breaking. "Non-terrestrial?" He nodded grimly. "It's not from here, Ethan. It's older than the mine, older than us." He hesitated, swallowing hard, before adding, "And they tried to weaponize it." Before we could say another word, a low rumbling shook the room, dust falling from the ceiling as the floor vibrated beneath our boots. Then came the sound again. That impossible voice, echoing from every direction at once, layered and broken, like 100 people speaking together. "Ethan, Harris, Join us." My chest tightened, my mind buzzing with static, and I stumbled back against the console as a strange warmth washed over me, a pressure behind my eyes that made it hard to think. I realized too late what was happening. It wasn't calling me. It was inside me. I clutched my head, gasping, feeling a strange sensation under my skin, like my thoughts were being pulled apart, stretched thin, fraying at the edges. Harris grabbed me, shouting something I couldn't hear through the ringing in my ears, dragging me toward the exit. But my legs felt heavy, unresponsive, like my body wasn't mine anymore. The voice wasn't just speaking to me. It was speaking through me. And in that moment, in the midst of panic and confusion, I understood something I wasn't supposed to. I could feel the layout of the tunnels below us, sense the echoing chambers hidden deeper under the rock, and I knew where the others were, the missing miners, the failed experiments, the ones it had collected. They were still down there, alive in some awful way, part of whatever this thing had become. I tore free of Harris's grip, stumbling forward, whispering words I didn't understand in a language my mouth shouldn't know. Harris caught me, shaking me violently, yelling my name, his eyes wide with horror. "Ethan, fight it! That's what it wants!" My vision blurred, darkness creeping in at the edges, but through the ringing in my head, I heard Harris shout something else, something that snapped me back for just long enough to breathe. "This is why it knows your name, kid. You were born here. Your father was part of Project Black Hollow. You're not just another miner. You're connected to it." I froze, the air catching in my throat, my stomach dropping as the weight of his words hit me like a collapse. My father, the project, the reason the thing kept calling me. Before I could respond, the glass cylinder behind us cracked loudly, splitting down the middle, and that layered voice roared from everywhere at once, shattering whatever fragile silence was left. "Come back." The floor shook violently beneath us, and Harris yanked me toward the far exit. We sprinted through the archive room, boots pounding against concrete, as something huge moved in the darkness behind us, its claws scraping, its breath wet and ragged, each step louder than the last. The emergency lights above us flickered to life one by one, illuminating shadows that stretched too far, bending unnaturally along the walls as we ran. My legs screamed, my lungs burned, and I could feel it gaining on us. And then I heard it again. My name, perfectly clear this time, spoken not by 100 voices but by one, my father's. "Ethan." I didn't dare look back. We ran through the archive corridor as the roar echoed behind us, wet and broken, like it came from 100 mouths layered together, and the sound vibrated in my chest until I could feel it in my bones. Harris pulled me by the arm, shouting over the pounding in my ears, "And keep moving, don't stop no matter what you hear." My lungs burned with every breath and my legs screamed in protest, but I pushed harder, the floor trembling beneath us as something massive moved in the darkness, chasing us through the abandoned research wing. The alarms overhead flickered once and died, plunging us back into shadows where the only light came from our helmet beams slicing across the walls. The hallway split into two paths, one leading back toward the upper levels, the other descending deeper beneath the mine, into uncharted territory. Harris hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning us downward. "We can't go back," he rasped between breaths. "It'll corner us in the upper shafts. Down's the only way." I didn't argue because, even without seeing it, I could feel the thing behind us, its presence pushing against the edges of my mind like static creeping under my skin, whispering in voices that weren't mine. "Ethan, come back. Come home." I clenched my fists until my nails dug into my palms, forcing the sound out of my head, forcing myself to focus on Harris's back as we barreled into the unknown. The tunnel curved into a steep descent, walls slick with condensation, the stone carved rougher and less uniform the deeper we went, until it was clear these passages weren't built by human hands. Strange grooves spiraled along the walls, etched into the stone like veins, glowing faintly under our lights, and with each step, the air grew heavier, thicker, until breathing felt like drowning. My ears popped violently as the pressure increased, and I stumbled, clutching the wall for balance until Harris grabbed my shoulder and steadied me, his face pale under the grime. "Stay with me, Ethan," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You're feeling it, aren't you, that pull?" I nodded without meaning to because he was right. Something deep inside me reacted to this place like a low vibration humming beneath my ribs, syncing with my heartbeat in ways I couldn't understand. We reached a heavy door set into the rock, ancient and rusted, its surface covered in strange markings like the ones we'd seen on the walls above, only deeper, more deliberate. Harris pushed against it, and with a groaning wail, the hinges gave way, revealing a vast chamber carved directly into the stone. It was massive, bigger than any cavern I'd ever seen, with stalactites hanging like jagged teeth from the ceiling and a pit yawning wide in the center, its depths vanishing into blackness. The walls glistened wet, reflecting the faint light of our helmets, and across the far side something unnatural loomed. A massive cylindrical structure fused into the rock, its metal warped and corroded, its surface lined with pipes that disappeared into the pit below. "This is it," Harris whispered, his voice hushed despite the roar of blood in my ears. "This is where they found it." He stepped forward slowly, carefully, and I followed, my eyes drawn to a row of consoles lining one side of the chamber, long dead but covered in yellowed documents sealed in cracked plastic. I wiped the dust from one and squinted at the faded text beneath the grime. The heading read, "Black Hollow Project, Core Sample Integration Report." My mouth went dry as I read the note scribbled in the margins. Core identified as non-terrestrial biological properties unmatched in catalog. Do not engage in vocal contact beyond auditory radius. Protocol, full isolation. Rule #7 applied. Following breach event. Harris glanced at the page, then at me, his jaw tightening. Rule #7 wasn't just about mimicry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's about connection. That thing doesn't just call your name, it learns you when you answer. It binds you to it. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening as fragments of memory surfaced. Things I didn't remember learning but somehow knew. Layouts of the tunnels, buried chambers, paths only the thing should know. I shook my head violently, forcing the thoughts away, but they kept creeping back. As if the deeper we went, the louder its presence became inside me. Then we heard it. Faint at first, from deep within the pit, but rising steadily, growing louder until the entire chamber seemed to vibrate with the sound. Rhythmic knocking, slow and deliberate, echoing off the walls. 1, 2, 3. A pause. Then again, faster this time, overlapping until the knocks became something else entirely, a warped, wet voice crawling into our ears. "Ethan, we're waiting." Harris grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the door, but my legs locked instinctively, rooted in place. Something inside me wanted to go closer, a compulsion rising in my chest like hunger, and my vision blurred as I stared into the endless flack of the pit. I heard whispers, not outside but inside my head. Fragments of sentences layered on top of one another. Too many voices to count, all speaking at once, and beneath them, one singular thought cutting through the chaos. "You belong." Here. Harris shoved me hard, snapping me out of it, his face inches from mine, his voice fierce. "Fight it, Ethan, that's how it gets you. It makes you think you're choosing, but you're not." I forced myself to breathe, grounding my focus on his voice, my fingers, gripping the strap of my flashlight so tightly it dug into my palm. The whispers faded slightly, but not completely, like static still buzzing at the edge of hearing. Then, without warning, a metallic groan echoed from across the chamber, and a massive steel grate set into the far wall began to shift. My breath caught in my throat as a blast of cold, fetid air rushed out, carrying the stench of rot and something sweeter, fouler beneath it. Shapes emerged in the shadows beyond the grate, tall, wrong, their limbs too long, their spines bent unnaturally, pale skin streaked black with coal dust, their heads tilted in unnatural synchrony as they stepped forward into the dim light, and my blood ran cold when I realized what they were. Turner, Cole, Ramirez, the missing miners from the 97 reports. Or what was left of them. Their faces were wrong, stretched thin, jaws slack, but their voices when they spoke in unison were horrifyingly familiar. "Help us." Harris yanked me backward, his voice raw with panic now. "Go! Run!" But my body hesitated, my feet dragging, like I was caught between two magnets, one pulling me toward the exit and one toward them, toward the thing beneath the pit. Then behind the broken miners, something else moved. Larger, heavier, and infinitely worse. From the shadows. It unfolded. It was taller than the steel supports, its form bending unnaturally, like it was built from hundreds of bodies fused into one, limbs twitching independently, its pale flesh glistening wet in the dim light. Its head, if you could call it that, shifted constantly, cycling through faces I recognized and didn't. My father's, Harris's, even my own. The sound it made wasn't a roar, but a chorus of layered whispers, all speaking different words but blending into something sickeningly human. "We are one." Harris shoved me toward the far exit, shouting, "Don't look at it! Move!" I turned and sprinted, my legs finally obeying, my boots slipping on the damp rock as the sound of hundreds of claws scraped against the walls behind us. The entire chamber shook as it moved, a deep reverberating thud rattling through the stone, like the heartbeat of the mine itself. We ran through a narrow maintenance tunnel, the air growing colder and thinner, my chest burning with every breath. The whispers followed us, bleeding through the stone, filling my head until I could barely think, and for a moment I felt myself slipping, like the thing was peeling me apart from the inside. Harris grabbed my wrist and pulled me around a corner, shoving me into a small alcove hidden behind a collapsed beam. We crouched low, holding our breath as the sound of dragging claws passed just feet away, and for one horrible second it paused outside, silent except for a low, wet sound, like breathing through water. Then slowly it moved on, deeper into the tunnels, the ground vibrating faintly beneath its weight until the sound finally faded. I turned to Harris, trying to speak, but he raised a shaking finger to his lips and whispered, "It's not done hunting us." And Ethan? He hesitated, his voice cracking for the first time since I met him. "It knows you're not like the others." I stared at him, my chest tightening, my stomach turning over. "What are you talking about?" Harris's eyes darted toward the pit behind us, then back at me. "Your father didn't just work here, kid. He was part of Project Black Hollow's lead team. You were born 2 years after they recovered sample 06B. You think it calls your name because you're unlucky?" He shook his head slowly, his expression grim and certain. "It calls you because part of it is already in you." The words hit me like a collapse, sharp and crushing, and before I could even breathe, the whispers in my head surged louder, drowning out everything else. My vision dimmed, the edges blurring, and I fell to my knees, clutching my skull, fighting against the pull dragging me toward the pit. I heard Harris shouting my name, felt him shaking me, but the sound was distant, muffled, drowned beneath the voice inside me whispering a single command. "Come back." Then from somewhere far above, deep in the upper shafts, a siren began to wail, a long, low tone that vibrated through the stone, cutting through the noise in my head like a blade. For the first time since entering Shaft 6, the whispers faltered. Harris grabbed my arm, hauling me to my feet, his voice fierce and urgent. "We're not finished, Ethan, but if we don't move now, we never will. Come on." We ran again, following the siren's distant hum, leaving the pit and the thing behind us in the dark, but I knew deep down, we hadn't escaped. It hadn't finished with us. It hadn't finished with me. The siren above us howled, muffled but steady, vibrating through the walls as if the entire mine itself was waking up, and Harris dragged me through the narrow maintenance tunnel, his grip iron tight on my arm, shouting over the low rumble that still echoed faintly from the pit behind us. My legs moved on instinct, lungs burning, my chest aching with every breath, and all the while the whispers scratched at the edges of my mind, faint now but persistent, like static behind a locked door. It wasn't gone. It would never be gone. We reached a junction where 3 tunnels branched off, the rock wet and glistening under our helmet lights, and Harris stopped, panting hard, leaning against the wall. He unfolded a crumpled map from his vest pocket with shaking hands, running his finger along the faded lines, his face pale beneath layers of sweat and coal dust. "Upper shafts this way," he said between ragged breaths, pointing toward the left passage. "We follow this up to level 3, find the old lift system, and pray to God it still works." But before I could respond, the whispers surged again, louder this time, and a cold sensation spread through my chest like liquid nitrogen, forcing me to double over, clutching my ribs. The static in my head sharpened into words. Too many voices to count, overlapping into one, and yet I understood them all. "Don't run." My vision blurred as the tunnels warped, edges bending unnaturally, shadows twisting like something alive, and I could feel it beneath us, awake now, aware, focusing entirely on me. Harris grabbed my shoulders and shook me hard, shouting, "Stay with me, Ethan. Fight it." I forced myself to breathe, dragging air into my lungs like glass, and the pressure slowly eased. But I knew that was temporary. We pressed on, climbing through the narrow incline, the siren's vibration fading as we rose higher. But then the sound we dreaded most came from below, the scraping of claws against stone, faint at first, then building quickly, a jerking, wet rhythm that moved faster than any living thing should. I glanced back just long enough to see shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls behind us, twitching, bending, climbing the rock like liquid. Harris saw it too and muttered, "It's coming." His voice raw before grabbing my arm and forcing me faster up the slope. We reached a landing where an old blast door hung open, its rusted frame bent inward like something massive had forced its way through. And beyond it, we stepped into a chamber that stopped me cold. It was vast, round, and unnatural. Smooth walls, curved upward into darkness, black veins twisting along the stone like roots, pulsating faintly under our lights as if the rock itself was breathing. In the center lay a massive steel cradle, ancient and broken, cables dangling loose into the void below. The shattered remains of containment glass glimmered faintly across the floor, sharp and wet with condensation, and on one rusted panel, barely legible through grime, were the words, "Project Black Hollow, Integration Facility." Harris stopped beside me, his breath catching, his eyes scanning the chamber like he'd been here before. I turned to him, voice hoarse and shaking. "You knew about this." He hesitated, lowering his helmet slightly, his silence telling me everything I needed to know. Finally, he muttered, "Your father built this room, Ethan. This was the first site where they connected to it." I stared at him, heart hammering, struggling to process the weight of his words. "Connected?" He nodded grimly. "It wasn't an accident. They found 06B here beneath the oldest rock layer, and they didn't just study it. They interfaced with it. Rule #7 wasn't just about the mimicry. It was a firewall. They realized too late the thing didn't just imitate voices, it reached back. Once you responded, it knew you, rewrote something inside your head, and then you became a part of its network, a signal waiting to be called home." My knees felt weak, my mind spinning, and I finally understood why it always knew my name, why the whispers never stopped. I wasn't just marked, I was connected. Before I could answer, the steel beneath us vibrated violently, dust raining from above as the deep, low roar returned, louder now, resonating through the walls until it felt like the whole chamber trembled in response. Then I saw it. From the far side of the pit, a pale, towering shape unfolded from the shadows, its body a patchwork of fused limbs and torsos, veins glowing faintly beneath translucent skin streaked black with coal dust, faces shifting beneath, its surface like trapped memories pressing against glass. And behind it, crawling along the walls and ceiling like pale spiders, came more of them. Smaller, wrong, their movements jerking in unnatural patterns as their eyes, if you could call them that, fixed on us from every angle. Harris swore, under his breath, fumbling with his rifle, and shouted, "We're out of time, run!" We bolted toward the far corridor, boots pounding against the steel grates, but the whispers slammed into me again, so loud now they drowned out everything. else, cutting deep into my thoughts until I couldn't tell which ones were mine anymore. They weren't words now, not exactly. They were feelings, raw and overwhelming. Hunger, belonging, inevitability. For a moment, my vision warped again, tunnels stretching unnaturally like a lens bending light. And I could see paths, Harris. Couldn't? Shortcuts through walls that shouldn't exist, like the mine itself was mapped into my blood. I stumbled, my breath ragged, and Harris grabbed me, shaking me, yelling something I couldn't hear. Finally, his voice cut through the static. "Ethan, fight it! That's not you, damn it, that's it!" We reached the old lift system, a rusted cage elevator bolted into the rock, its frame groaning under the weight of years. Harris shoved me inside, slamming the gate closed as the creatures poured into the chamber behind us, their movements sharp and twitching, their pale bodies glistening. In the dim light, he yanked the lever hard, and with a screech of rusted metal, the lift lurched upward, climbing painfully slow toward the upper levels. Below us, the massive entity surged forward, its limbs snapping like wet rope, climbing the walls faster than the lift could carry us. I grabbed the gate, knuckles white, watching in horror as one of the smaller things launched itself from the wall, slamming into the side of the cage. Its jaw gaped unnaturally wide, rows of needle-thin teeth clicking, together as it clawed at the bars, shrieking a sound that made my skull ache. Harris emptied his last magazine into it, the deafening blasts echoing up the shaft, and the thing finally dropped away, disappearing into the black below. But the larger one kept coming. We cleared level 3 just as the cage shuddered violently. Under its weight, its massive hand gripping the bars with bone-snapping strength, metal bending inward with a scream. Harris reached for his knife, but I stopped him, something deep inside me shifting, awakening. And without thinking, I stepped forward, gripping the cold bars and shouting down the shaft. Not words, but a sound, low and resonant, vibrating. In my chest, a sound I didn't know I could make. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by silence so deep it rang in my ears. Below us, the massive creature froze, tilting its head slowly, its hundreds of faces turning toward me in unison, and then slowly it let go, collapsing back into the darkness like it had been commanded. I stumbled back, panting, my head spinning, the echoes of that strange voice still rattling through me. Harris stared at me, wide-eyed, his face pale as ash. "Ethan, what the hell was that?" I shook my head, my voice cracking when I finally spoke. "I don't know, but it listened." He swallowed hard, staring into the shaft below. "That's why it's after you. You're not just connected to it, yet you control it." The lift groaned as it reached the surface, the gate slamming open automatically, flooding us with the cold, damp night air. I staggered out into the open, collapsing onto the wet gravel beneath the stars, the silence above ground crushing compared to the chaos below. Harris dropped beside me, breathing hard, his rifle empty, his hands trembling. For a few precious seconds, neither of us spoke, just sucking in air and staring at the dark tree line beyond the mine entrance. But then faintly, deep below the earth, we heard it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, echoing through the stone, followed by a single soft whisper that carried like wind through the tunnels. "Ethan." Harris turned to me, his voice hoarse, heavy with dread. We didn't stop it, we just woke it up. And for the first time I believed him, because deep down, I could still hear it, and it wasn't calling for help anymore, it was calling me home.